Terrorism in Paris and Brussels and a massive refugee crisis have dominated the headlines, but those are only a few of the daunting challenges facing the European Union. As Europe continues to recover from the longest recession in its history, overexpansion, instability in Ukraine, the Greek economy, rising nationalism, and a possible exit by Britain are some of the other issues facing the 28 member states. The question is, do EU countries still share the values that first brought them together? Later, we'll talk with the former ambassador for the European Union, but we begin in Berlin with CCTV's Guy Henderson. And Guy, I mentioned a few of those challenges. Put them in perspective for us. What are some of the more formidable challenges facing the EU, and how do they get resolved?
Well, I think one of the interesting things to note about that long list of crises that at times you wonder whether Europe is being slightly overwhelmed by is the extent to which many people would feel that they are to some extent linked. So you talked, for example, about the rise in nationalism. That's something we've seen here in Germany in the last few weeks or so. Important state elections here in which a right-wing anti-immigration party won big gains. In one state, it became the second largest party in that state. Now, part of the reason for that, is, of course, the huge influx of refugees coming to Europe at the moment. The next question then, of course, is why are so many refugees coming to Europe at the moment? Well, that is down to a changing international environment, an increasing number of conflicts around Europe's borders. From Syria, we've seen again a flare-up in tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Don't forget the conflict in Yemen. No large influx of refugees there yet, but certainly fears about that. And then North Africa as well, and particularly Libya is of a primary concern to European leaders at the moment. Various diplomatic processes underway to try and bring some semblance of peace to regions like that. And certainly the internationalist perspective on this would be that if you're able to solve one of the problems along that long chain, you therefore potentially improve the chances of solving some of the other items on that list as well.
So certainly a lot of stresses on the EU right now. What might the Union look like several years from now?
Well, that is the trillion-dollar question, perhaps more. A very difficult question to answer with any certainty. What I can perhaps give you is a summary, or some of a summary of the various schools of thought on that issue. Now, it's not uncommon these days to hear people talk about Europe's facing an existential crisis, a threat to its very existence at the moment. But I think it's important to point out that that isn't widely seen as a complete disintegration of the EU or a threat of, but more a change of the EU from its current form. Now, of course, the dominant debate at the moment is about whether various countries, including the UK, as you've mentioned, might soon look to leave the European Union. But it's important to note in the longer term that it is actually still possible that there'll be expansion. There are a number of countries from Iceland to the Balkans to Turkey that are in the process of negotiating entering the European Union, not leaving it. Another debate that is particularly forceful at the moment, given this number of crises, is the structure that the EU might take. So in Germany, for example, furious debate here, and this is certainly the heart of the argument, which says that the reason that the European Union is suffering all these crises at the moment is because it's not integrated enough. On the other hand, you have countries like the United Kingdom, more Eurosceptic countries like Denmark, for example, whose citizens and voters, or at least perhaps a good number of its citizens and voters, might say that that's impossible, that there should at least be several speed system in the European Union, where different countries can opt out of essentially measures on immigration, taxing, foreign policy, intelligence sharing, that they perhaps have more reservations about. But forecasting, as you know, I'm sure it is extremely difficult. Those are just some of the debates and scenarios that are being floated around here.
Thanks, Guy. That's CCTV's Guy Henderson reporting from Berlin. John Bruton was first elected to the Irish Parliament at the age of 22. He went on to serve as the country's Prime Minister and the European Union's ambassador to the United States. He joins us now from Ireland. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
So, Prime Minister, the European Union, as we know, is facing some very steep challenges right now. The migrant refugee crisis, the Greek debt crisis, a British referendum, plus issues with Russia, as well as the rise of extremism in Europe. Why are European nations finding it so difficult to find a common position on these issues?
Well, the European Union is a gathering together of 28 sovereign states who in some areas cooperate under a legal agreement, but in other areas they have no agreement. And the issue of refugees, for example, is one where there is no formal legal basis for the European Union requiring its members to take a given number of refugees. So they have to work by persuasion. And that's obviously quite difficult. A union of 28 sovereign states can't act as quickly as, say, the United States could, where it is a federal state with central powers.
I understand the legal aspects of that, but what about the spirit of the agreement, the spirit of the union? Should they not be acting in unison?
They should, and I think we have, each of the 28 states in the European Union has a clear obligation, for example, to take refugees. That's something that dates back to the aftermath of the Second World War, the International Refugee Conventions, which require us to give shelter to people who are fleeing imminent death because of war. And there's no doubt that people who are fleeing from Syria are fleeing the possibility of imminent death. That isn't true of immigrants coming from other countries, but from Syria, that certainly is the case. And we have an obligation to provide shelter for them. What's happening, of course, is that they're arriving in Greece and they're not being shared out among the 28 countries. Germany, generously, in my view, has agreed to take quite a substantial number, but there are other countries who are taking none at all, and the United Kingdom is not part of the arrangements and it's not taking any either. So that means that there isn't a proper sharing of the burden or responsibility of taking in refugees among the 28 member states. And that's something which the Union is working hard to resolve, but because of the nature of the Union, it's a slow process.
Is that search for a common policy going to get any easier in the years ahead? Or is there a danger that the European Union could one day become a very loose confederation of states with perhaps regional powers acting in their own interests? How does it overcome this challenge?
Well, the European Union was set up precisely to avoid that situation where you had powers acting in their own interests, a balance of power situation in Europe, which gave us 2 or 3 major wars over the last 150 years. The European Union was set up over 50 years ago to ensure that we never went back to that. And that's one of the reasons why it's very regrettable that the United Kingdom, which has been involved in protecting democracy in Europe in the past, in Poland and in Belgium earlier, is now wanting or considering whether it might opt out of the European Union altogether. The fact is, what happens in one part of Europe affects all who live elsewhere in Europe. And we have to. It's a practical requirement that we cooperate. And the European Union is the means we have of doing it. Therefore, I think we need to deal with issues like refugees. We need to deal with issues like better intelligence sharing to counter terrorism. We need to act together to protect the sovereignty of our member states if that's threatened, for example, as you suggested in one of your questions, by Russia.
With the United Kingdom playing such an important role in the European Union, as you've pointed out, can Europe survive if Britain leaves the Union?
Well, if Britain is looking at this, it seems to me, following the debate, living in Ireland, I'm able to follow the debate in the UK quite closely. They're looking at this as if this was a freestanding decision that they can make for themselves and that they have no responsibility for the effects that might have. Well, now, if Britain leaves the European Union, that would be the first case of a country leaving the European Union. Well, Greenland, after a 6-year-long negotiation as part of Denmark, left the European Union, but her full state has never left the European Union before, and that would, I think, do a lot of damage to the structure of peace and security that we built up in Europe. I don't think it would serve Britain's interests. Nobody knows what sort of new arrangement, if there would be a new arrangement, between a Britain outside the European Union and the European Union would be. Ireland, where I live, would be dramatically affected, because we would then become, as a European Union country, having a land border with a country that had left the European Union, the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland. So we might have to erect customs posts, passport controls, all sorts of things would have to be done in Ireland that would adversely affect the peace process, for example, that we built up, which has reconciled conflicts that had existed and caused so much bloodshed on the island of Ireland in the past.
Now, that referendum on British membership is going to be held in June. The British Prime Minister David Cameron has been able to negotiate some concessions from the European Union. Do you think that that's going to be enough to keep Britain in the Union?
Well, those concessions are very minor in my view. They would slow down, in fact, rather than speed up the decision-making in the European Union by introducing new hurdles which would have to be crossed for certain EU rules to be adopted. But if that's what he feels he needs to persuade his electorate, it's probably good that he has been given whatever he feels he needs. But the truth of the matter is that the real issue is, can Britain influence its own future and influence the world around it better by being in a European Union with 27 other member states, or can it do the job better on its own? I believe it can do the job much better in the European Union. If it is on its own, it will have to renegotiate all its trade agreements, not just with the European Union, but with all the other countries which are now trading with Britain as part of the European Union. Those agreements would be gone and would have to be replaced. We could have years and years of uncertainty about trade flows and the export of services affecting the United Kingdom, which would be extremely bad for investment in the United Kingdom, but also extremely bad for investment in Europe as a whole.
Another issue that placed great strains on the European Union was the Greek debt crisis. How was that handled in your view? Was this a case of richer, bigger countries in the EU basically imposing their will on a poorer nation?
Well, Greece did borrow the money. It was for many years spending more, paying pensions earlier, and raising less tax or not collecting tax properly. And it was bridging the gap between spending and tax receipts by borrowing. Gradually, that borrowing reached a point where Greece could no longer borrow. Lenders were not prepared to lend to it. So what happened was that the taxpayers of other Eurozone countries, not Britain, but the Eurozone countries, stepped in and they said, well, we'll lend you the money. Our taxpayers will lend you the money. But obviously, if you are borrowing money from the taxpayers of another country, it's not unreasonable that the governments of those other countries would want to impose certain conditions to ensure that you did everything you could do to pay, or to put yourself in a position to pay that money back. And that's what's going on with Greece. Greece has made very many reforms, but there are some worries that it hasn't gone far enough, for example, in its pension reforms. For instance, people could retire in Greece much younger, at a much younger age than they could retire in Germany. And that obviously caused certain aggravation to German taxpayers who are saying, well, the Greeks want some of their debts that they owe to us written off, but they're still paying themselves pensions at a younger age than one can qualify for a pension in Germany. So those sorts of changes are having to be made by the Greeks. I think it's not unreasonable.
And if we look at the migrant or refugee or asylum crisis, we see very different responses from the older members of the European Union, countries like Germany, France, Italy, and the newer members like Hungary, Poland, the Baltic states. And when we look at the way in which these different sets of countries look at the same problem, are they, in effect, two Europes that we're talking about here?
I think there's more than two. I think not all of the older members are being as forthright and forthcoming as Germany has been in accepting refugees from Syria. For instance, I'm not aware that any refugees from Syria have so far come to Ireland or to Britain. Not too many have gone to France either. Germany, on the other hand, is offering asylum to people from Syria. It's going to obviously be a big challenge. On the other hand, many of these people are very well educated and could make a very valuable contribution to the German economy. And in the medium to long term, Europe is going to have a major labour shortage. We're not going to have enough people of working age earning money to pay the pensions that we will be wanting to pay in future to the very large number of people who will have passed retirement age. So we need in Europe to bring in younger people of working age from outside. So this could be an opportunity as much as a problem.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for joining us.